Good morning. My name is Bob Cochran. I'm the director of the Newt Barr Institute, which is the sponsoring organization of this conference. And it's been a terrific learning experience for me, as I know it has been for many of you. It was several months ago that Jim Gash, maybe Jim could wave at everybody. Most of you have probably had a chance to meet Jim. He's on the faculty here at Pepperdine. Jim came to me. He had been spending a semester, his sabbatical semester in Uganda with our Global Justice Program, which is also a part of Newt Barr. And he said, we need to have a conference on international adoption. Well, my reaction was that there wouldn't be very much to talk about. Because from my very limited experience, it just struck me as an unalloyed good. I mean, as a part of my work with the Newt Barr Institute, had been to Rwanda, Uganda, South Sudan, Korea, Thailand. Every place that I'd visited, it just seemed there were orphans, there were very poor kids, there were kids that were severely disabled. Who wouldn't want to provide nice, safe homes for these kids? And then I've known people who have known several people who've adopted kids from overseas, and they're the most caring, loving people I know. We haven't done an adoption, but we've got 3 kids of our own, and raising a kid is the most challenging thing I think you can do in this world, or one of them. I'm always reminded of a statement my wife made one time. Our kids were young, and she found that she had some, mole or some dermatology thing on her back that needed to be removed. And so she had to go in just for in-and-out surgery at a clinic. And she said as she lay there on the operating table, her reaction was, "This is the most relaxing thing I've done in months." And people who adopt kids from overseas assume a whole lot more challenges than typically than people who adopt from from within the United States or raise their own kids. So I'm thinking, what is it that we're going to be talking about? Well, Jim and others have convinced me that there are challenges that needed to be addressed, and we've addressed them in this conference. Well, it was almost miraculous the way this conference came together, because Jim said, well, there's a guy named David Smolin who's a law professor who's written in the area. Well, Jim had no idea that I knew David Smolin. He and I have done projects together for 25 years, and he's a very close friend. I touched base with David, and he said, well, right there at Pepperdine, you've got Bert Ballard, who's just joined your faculty. He's the guy. I mean, between David and Bert, they knew everybody in the field, whether they suggested Betsy Bartholet and others, and so the conference very quickly took form. And so that's what we have. Today, we've got a couple of keynote speakers to head things off in this panel. They'll go in the order in which I introduce them. Jed Medefin serves as president of the Christian Alliance for Orphans. It's an organization uniting more than 100 Christian groups who seek to equip and inspire those desiring to care for orphans and vulnerable children. Previously, Jed led the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. I already mentioned Bert. Bert is here at Pepperdine on our communications faculty. He was a key organizer of the conference. Prior to coming to Pepperdine, as many of you know, Bert co-chaired the 2010 Intercountry Adoption Summit in Ontario, Canada. Bert is himself adopted from Vietnam. He was adopted as a child, and his wife have themselves adopted a child from Vietnam. So, Jed.
Well, good morning. I don't know about you all, but I have just so enjoyed the conversations and the provocation and just all the interactions with folks here. And it's just really remarkable to have in this same room these, what really in many ways are these polar opposites on issues. And in the same space and seeing very contrary ideas coming head to head. And yet at the same time, what for me has been I was thinking about this last night, how amazing it is that every person in this room shares something that a lot of people don't share, which is we care deeply about children. And we have this deep sense that children matter, especially children that have very little voice. And so despite these incredible differences we have, it's special to feel that kinship despite the profound differences that are here. And as Bob mentioned, I lead the Christian Alliance for Orphans. It's a coalition of 130 organizations now, as well as a network of churches that all just care deeply about what they would call the cause of the fatherless, or orphans in distress. And they work, each of them in their own spheres. Some are adoption agencies. Some are focused on foster care in the U.S. and mentoring efforts here. Others work exclusively overseas, caring for orphans and vulnerable children in other countries. But all of them share a deep commitment to caring for children and also to the Christian faith that motivates them into this. And the goal is really both to inspire and equip Christians to live out their faith in many ways, but especially with a focus on caring for orphans. And so it's from that vantage point, I really have the privilege of getting to see windows into this thing that we often describe as the Christian orphan care movement. Seeing organizations involved, seeing some of the leaders, some of the families that are really in the center of adopting and fostering and mentoring, all the different things. And so what I'd like to do in my time today is provide you with some of the windows that I have into that, seeing both some of the history, going back deep, the present expressions, and then hopefully offering at the end a little bit of critique, as well as hopes for the future for this movement. Got a PowerPoint and some pictures here, so let's see if we can get this going. So thinking historically, first of all, key point here, that Christians caring for orphans is in no way a new phenomenon. It really goes back to the earliest days of the Christian church. In ancient Rome, there was a practice called exposing. That's how unwanted babies were often gotten rid of, whether the child was deformed or female and they wanted a male child, or perhaps it was just inconvenient. The child was taken outside the city walls and left there for the sun and wind and rain and wild animals to do their work. And Christians of that time, even though they were a small and persecuted minority at that time, earned a reputation as a people who would go outside the city walls and they would find these children and take them in and care for them and often raise them as their own. And this identity as a people who would pay special attention to the children that were at the margins is something that really has been a part of the Christian DNA throughout the Christian church. In the 3rd century, there was Afra of Augsburg, and she was a former prostitute who, after her Christian conversion, really spent much of her life caring for the abandoned children of other prostitutes and others, and actually set up a network of homes where they could be cared for in families. In the 12th century and throughout the Middle Ages, many devout Christians saw caring for orphans as a very important part of their living out their faith. And there was Princess Elizabeth of Bratislava who established the first hospital for foundlings in the 12th century. George Mueller in 19th century England really challenged Christians of his time to care for the orphans in England there. And he was accused of elevating the poor above their station. But that was what he felt like was a central expression of faith. In the early 20th century, many of you may have heard of Pandita Ramabai, who was born a wealthy Brahmin, but after her conversion to Christianity made a primary focus in caring for both abused women and elevating the status of women, as well as orphans in a lot of different contexts. And so these, of course, individuals just represent kind of little tips of icebergs. They're the visible individuals, but really this vision has been lived out throughout the history of the church in individual homes and families and relationships in ways that really history doesn't much note. But it has always been a core part of the Christian DNA. And so what we see today in terms of this movement really is just a recapturing, a resurgence of something that has always been there. It's been something that over the last 5 to so years has been widely noted. New York Times talking about this orphan care movement, and increasingly taking up orphan care as a tenet of their faith. Christianity Today writing about the Christian Alliance for Orphans Summit, which has kind of become a hub, a gathering hub for people that care about these things. And the author described watching those gathered at the summit. I knew this was not my parents' generation, that there was something fresh and strong and vibrant stirring there. The Wall Street Journal talking about foster to adoption in the U.S. and how more and more churches are taking that on, and the way that has actually even changed the appearance of some churches. And World Magazine describing how many of these families that are getting involved don't just see this as a trend, but really as a recapturing of the core essence of the Christian faith. And so you see this expressed in a lot of different ways. One is interesting. The ECFA, which tracks giving trends within evangelical circles, their giving report, which their most recent came out in 2012, so the data is a little bit old, but this is looking at the change in giving from 2010 to 2011. And over that year in 2011 represented for the 500 largest charities in the U.S., an increase of giving of 0.2%. We're in the thick of a hard economic times, but very, very small growth. To all evangelical nonprofits, 3.4% growth. But to Christian orphan care, what they tracked was roughly a 20% increase in giving. And of the 29 categories that the ECFA tracked, actually 3 of the top 4 directly related to orphan care and adoption. Adoption was about a 15% increase. Orphan care was about 20%, and child sponsorships 24%. So this real focus on caring for the plight of orphans and vulnerable children, as again evidenced in a lot of different ways. Here's another glimpse at that. The National Summit, which I mentioned earlier, is really kind of there's lots of actual conferences related to these themes that range in everything from getting involved in the local foster system to supporting things overseas. Some are focused very heavily on adoption, but the summit is kind of a national hub for all of these things once a year. And if you look at the growth in just the number of people coming from 2004, there was about 39 folks that showed up when they had this gathering. Every year it's grown significantly, and this past year more than 2,000 people. And these are folks who are going to go back to their churches now, and they're leading in efforts to try to get their churches to engage these things in very personal ways. Here's just some glimpses of Summit. Every year we're in a different location. And in May we'll be in Nashville, but this past year we were in Southern California for the first time. Another expression of this movement is something called Orphan Sunday. And it actually began in a small church in Zambia. A pastor, Billy Chandwe, was the pastor of a church of about 100 or so people, and it was very hard-pressed. In its own right. It was at the real peak of the HIV/AIDS crisis there. Many of his church members actually themselves were HIV positive, and yet as he noted the many orphans in that community, he challenged the people in the church saying, this needs to be an expression of our faith. We are hard-pressed, but we need to live this out for these orphans who are even more hard-pressed than we are. And it just so happened that there was an American visiting, and he was so moved by what he saw as individuals of this church literally got up and they walked to the front of the church and they took off their own shoes and laid them there and said, these are for kids in this community that do not have families. And there was someone that brought a head of cabbage forward, that this was the dinner that she had planned. She'd picked it up at the market, but she was there in church that afternoon, and she just took that and laid that forward. And this American was so moved by that, he said, we, as an American church, desperately need more of this heart and this spirit. And so he brought this idea of Orphan Sunday back with him to the U.S. And in 2009, the Christian Alliance for Orphans began to really try to grow this as a vision throughout the U.S. as a day, as a catalyst for people that care about these things to take that case to their church community. And so every year that has grown dramatically. This past year there was hundreds of thousands of people who were in church services and at events and things that focused on this. And each one was very different. Some were a pastor preaching on God's heart for the vulnerable. And others, there was a heart gallery out in the foyer where there was pictures of kids in the foster system. And others, they did fundraisers for water wells in Africa or education projects to help with education. So lots of different expressions. But this has been an important catalyst as well for the growing movement. And of course, it was such an interesting thing for me as over the course of the Orphan Sunday weekend, just people posting up, on their Facebook pages and things, different expressions of what this looked like in their churches and their families and their communities. Again, trying to stir Christians to really understand that this is something that God cares deeply about. And if we just live self-centered, self-absorbed lives, just looking out for our own, that is not a full expression of Christian faith. Looking now at some of the trends that are happening in this movement. There are, one of the things I would note is that early on in this movement, if you go back 5 to 7, 8 years, a lot of the growth and the energy for it really came largely out of adoptive families and with a heavy emphasis on intercountry adoption. And at that time, a lot of the adoptions were primarily younger, healthy children, although not exclusively. That was where a lot of the discussions and energy was. The very first summit that I mentioned, a lot of the people there were adoption agency people or adoptive parents who really were focused on that. And slowly, the discussion, the focus has really broadened and deepened in different ways that we'll talk about a little bit this morning. But one of the things we're seeing recently is more and more families, as they ask, where is the greatest need, they come to understand that it's not, frankly, for adopting healthy young infants, that it's often, special needs children, older children, sibling groups, and so more and more families are opening themselves to that. That comes with some special challenges, obviously, that we'll talk about a little bit, but also, some really beautiful stories out of that. Another is just an increasing engagement in foster care. So an expansion from kind of a focus on intercountry adoption to really more heavy focus on the local foster system. And I noted a couple of the articles that have observed that. One of the more significant stories in that is in Colorado, where just a large network of churches has really placed special focus on kids in the foster system and kids that are waiting to be adopted. And believe it or not, I think this would be a shock to many, but focus on the family has been a central actor in that, really challenging people to get involved with that. And then there's other groups, Project 127, there's an alliance of churches, the Northern Colorado Alliance for Orphans, and they are all working together to really engage that. And in 2008, we had about 865 children waiting in the foster system to be adopted. By 2010, that number was under 400. And I just spoke a few weeks ago with the woman who heads the state foster to adopt programs, and she told me, she said, they're under 300 now. And I just asked her about it, and she said, everyone knows who's doing this. It's the churches. They're taking kids that in the past no one else would take. Another expression of this is a focus on family preservation efforts. One of the more vibrant expressions of that is what's called the Safe Families Program, that in essence is a totally voluntary parallel to the foster system. So the parents are unpaid, they're volunteers through their church, and then the families that are placing the children, they are not yet in the legal system. They may be headed there. Their social worker may say, you're on drugs, and you're about to go into foster care, but they voluntarily place their children while they are trying to get their lives together. A lot of times, some of these people are going into prison for a certain period of time, and so it's actually a voluntary placement intended to circumvent the foster system so kids don't end up as legal wards of the state, but are temporarily cared for in caring families and then can be returned to their families. And often the churches that do this actually also provide mentoring and other supports for the birth parent or parents, trying to help them in that process of getting back on their feet. And so that started in Chicago. Last year there was 1,000 placements in just the Chicago region alone. And there's now more than 65 sites in the U.S. and I believe 3 in the U.K. Another very important development is a focus on helping the local church in other countries to really engage as foster, adoptive, and other care for orphans. It's something that I feel very passionately about. We just recently, for the Christian Alliance for Orphans, hired someone to focus on this full time. And the goal is really to take the network and strengths that the Christian Alliance for Orphans has, including many people who are really experts in child development, in nutrition issues, in attachment and parenting, and come alongside local leaders who really already have a vision for this and just help them in whatever ways they need, whether it's with expertise like that or helping them build websites for what they want to do. Not an American vision imported, but really they're trying to do something, and we want to say, everything we have, we want it to be at your disposal. So just for instance, this past week, there was a conference in Kiev. More than 500 leaders from across Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe, all gathering with this same vision in mind. How, many of them pastors, but also lay leaders, how can we live out care for the fatherless in our countries? And I think that's the vision that we have articulated at the Christian Alliance for Orphans, is that the local church in every nation will ultimately rise as the primary answer for the orphans in their midst. You see this in Orphan Sundays now being celebrated around the world, which is a wonderful story of a gift from Zambia coming to the U.S. and now echoing in other parts of the world as well. And if you have time, I would commend to you, there's a documentary, if you're interested in digging a little deeper on that, called Zambia's Gift to the World, which was released last year. And it kind of tells some of this story. It's just like a 33-minute film. And if you're interested in learning more, I'd encourage that. So let's talk for a little bit about the question, why now? Why this very visible resurgence of Christian focus on orphans and the fatherless and these things, adoption, foster care, mentoring, all these things? Why now? A few of the things that I think have played a key role. One is the shrinking world. Just the simple reality that painful truths that were far away are now closer than ever. They're on our television, they're on the internet, and it's just more of a reality. It's harder to avoid today. I think the AIDS crisis played a role in that because it really made very visible this crisis. And of course, everyone knows that orphans have been created. That's part of the discussion about global AIDS. And so there has been an awakening to the special need that is there with many of these vulnerable children, some of them single orphans, some of them double orphans, as a result of HIV/AIDS. Another thing that I would note is what I would call the reunion of orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And this would be a much deeper discussion, but I'll just mention it briefly, that historically in the early part of the 20th century, there was kind of a split within the Christian church between one group, which was kind of the mainline denominations that really focused on what was called the social gospel, soup kitchens and feeding programs, and then what was the more conservative branch that was really focused on making sure to hold to historic Christian truths, orthodoxy. And they became really, kind of warring camps almost, oil and water. And so those on the more conservative side that were holding to kind of historic Christian ideas and concepts sometimes saw folks who would talk about, feeding programs and justice issues as kind of people on the other side. And what has happened over the last 20 years is what I would view as a very positive development, where there has been a reuniting of a commitment to historic Christian ideas, and at the same time, a real desire to live those out in very concrete, tangible actions for justice and mercy. And so a lot of this orphan care movement is coming out of more conservative churches, but instead of them just focusing on trying to have the right theology and the right beliefs, they really are seeking to live that out in very tangible ways. There's also been a number of key leaders that have played an important role in this. Rick Warren, Stephen Curtis Chapman, Dennis Rainey. The book Fields of the Fatherless by Tom Davis was probably one of the first to really get people talking about these issues in a significant way. And then, without trying to overemphasize the Christian Alliance for Orphans, the Alliance has, I think, played an important role where you have a really rare example of all of these organizations who in many ways are competing for funds, for volunteers, for attention, are working together through a shared alliance for a shared vision that's larger than any one organization. And so all of these things have played an important role in this resurgence of Christian focus on adoption, orphan care, foster care. But I would also emphasize something else, that these alone do not explain it. That ultimately, the deeper wellspring is the same wellspring that it has been for the church ever since the very first days in the Roman Empire, when they were rescuing exposed babies. And that is that it is flowing out of the deepest parts of the Christian faith. And so in the Bible, you see a very clear mandate to care for the orphan and the fatherless. You see it in Isaiah, take up the cause of the fatherless. You see it plead the case of the widow. You see it in Psalms, defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and oppressed. James 1:27 describes pure religion as looking after orphans and widows in their distress. So there's a clear mandate. But if we dig even deeper, it goes deeper than just raw obedience to a command alone. You see actually that there is a certain mirror of the character of God. This is what Christians believe to be true about the heart of God. That whereas the Roman gods and the Greek gods were interested in generals and athletes and the beautiful people, the God of the Bible actually placed special emphasis on those that are most in need, most destitute, least in the center of the spotlight, least powerful. And so God describes himself as someone who defends the cause of the fatherless, the very same language that he actually sends to his people as a mandate, he describes of himself. Or in Psalm 68, where it says, "A father to the fatherless, a defender of widows is God in his holy dwelling. He sets the lonely in families." And so this priority on caring for the vulnerable child, the orphan, and setting the lonely in families, putting a priority upon that familial relationship is something that Christians see as a mirroring of God's character. And then finally, beyond this, there is the powerful metaphor, ultimately, of the heart of the Christian story itself. The Christian story is of the God who pursued his creatures, his children, when they were destitute and alone. They were separated from him. And he draws them to himself, and he invites them to live as his sons and daughters and to call him Abba, Father. It's a very intimate and beautiful picture, and there are some of those verses and some of those things that actually speak specifically of adoption, but I would argue that we could get in the nuances of arguing about exactly what that term means and miss the fact that the whole Christian narrative is essentially a story of God pursuing and drawing to himself and inviting to become us all to become his children in a very special and intimate way. And so all of these things really are the ultimate heart of the Christian orphan care movement. You see this is not something new. I just recently came across this in the Code of Justinian, which I read every evening, from the 6th century, that it was actually spelled out that children found abandoned, exposed, orphaned, were to be treated with Christian care and compassion. They could not be just taken in as household help. They could not be treated as restivics. That was not acceptable. And in fact, it was encouraged that they be adopted, quote, even as we ourselves have been adopted into the kingdom of grace. That is and has always been the wellspring of the Christian orphan care movement. Today, 5th century, 1st century. Now, I would very much affirm that there is, in any meaningful movement, a deep need always for serious self-critique and criticism. And I think the better the cause, the more that is needful, because we can be blinded by the fact that this cause is so meaningful. And I think that goes for any significant undertaking throughout history. It was true in the abolition movement. There were certain blind spots. There were many internal conflicts that needed to be worked out among the advocates there. Some people were absolutely over the top. Someone like William Lloyd Garrison was amazing in igniting Americans against slavery, and yet he could be very obnoxious. And so, these are things that are a part of any movement, and I think that can be a part of the Christian orphan care movement today as well. I would just mention these four as some of the biggest, although there's certainly others, but one I would mention is the tendency at times towards adoption cheerleading. just focusing on, hey, adoption's wonderful, it's beautiful, it's redemptive. Here's the story of this family that had a great experience, and not speaking frankly of the complexity, of the great difficulty, especially when a child perhaps is coming from an institutional background and they bear deep wounds, and the healing process can be lifelong. And so that is something that has been, I think, a real blind spot. I think it's very much changing. I think the conversation increasingly focuses on both the beauty as well as the great challenges, but that's an ongoing need. Secondly, the theology. I think at times some within the movement, and I would emphasize some, but some have focused so heavily on the idea of the adoption of theology, which is indeed a beautiful thing, but they have missed the fact that that's just one of the biblical metaphors for God's relationship with his people. There's so many others. There's the marriage of the metaphor of marriage. There's the potter and the clay. There's the mother hen and its chicks. These are all meaningful metaphors. And so the movement both needs to understand that there certainly are many different metaphors for God's relationship, and also understand the limits of any metaphor. At some point, any metaphor breaks down. And we need to guard against some of what could be potentially harmful overextensions of the metaphor, including the fact that, at times it could make it hard for adoptees to talk about their experience prior to adoption and other things like that. These are deep waters, but I'm just kind of mentioning these. Number 3, glossing over complexity. When you're aiming for something good and you know that there's some wonderful ends that you're pursuing, it can be very easy to gloss over how very, very complex situations can be. So this would include the role of money in the adoption process, the complexity of racial relations in the U.S. and multiracial families, the role of poverty in adoption or in other crises as well. So these are things that definitely need to be taken very seriously. And again, I really see the movement increasingly embracing and taking on these complexities, but I think it's still a place for critique. And then finally, assuming good motives equal good solutions. And I see that in every realm of philanthropy and USAID and UNICEF and there's a tendency to think, well, I really want good for these kids or these people, and so therefore what I'm doing must be good. It must be effective. And that is not the case. The history of doing good is rife with all kinds of good intentions that are either proved ineffective or often counterproductive. And so that's something that this movement needs to be very attuned to as well. At the same time, I would also note that sometimes the critics of the movement miss some very significant things. One of those would be the simple reality that addressing deep human needs is always painfully complex. In my prior work, I had the privilege of being involved with work that related to everything from prisoner reentry, homelessness, addiction, ARVs in Africa, and every single one of those. I could give you story after story of how people made bad decisions, things that went terribly wrong, unintended consequences. If you think about in Somalia when there was, 5 minutes? In Somalia when there was this famine and food was shipped over there, a lot of it was diverted to warlords and used to fund the warlords' efforts. Now, I didn't hear anyone calling for a stop to feeding programs in times of famine. We just understood that there's hazard and it needs to be rooted out. And you could give example after example of that. The UN brought cholera back to Haiti. Some of the workers did. No one was saying, UN, get out of Haiti. It was just the reality that this is going to be part of the painfully complex realities of addressing human need. Secondly, I think it's a real false dichotomy to pit intercountry adoption against other expressions of orphan care. A lot of times we'll talk about them in the silos. But the reality of what I've seen is that many of the people that are passionate about intercountry adoption are actually the most passionate also about foster care. Or I was, just a few months back, I was with a gentleman named Larry Bergeron. He is an adoptive dad. He had formerly been an executive with Pitney Bowes, rode from New Jersey to New York every day in a limousine that picked him up. But part of what really transformed him was adopting, and that opened his eyes and his heart to the world. Now he created and leads an organization that delivers hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds of food to crisis situations all over the world. And these things are interwoven. I could tell you stories of families that adopted internationally and now are raising funds through coffee sales and handicraft to fund education projects in those countries. I could tell you about others that adopted internationally and now really have realized there's precious kids just like this on the other side of the tracks, and I'm going to get involved in mentoring kids in the foster system. And so these things are very interwoven, and to see them as competing, I think is actually very mistaken for anyone who cares about the broader picture of children. And then finally, speed matters. Speed really matters. You know, for every 2 months that a child spends in an orphanage, they lose an IQ point. Every 2 months. That was one study, and each orphan is different. So I want to emphasize that there's some that are much better than others, but ultimately, kids that are growing up without families, you see it in the physical development, you see it in mental development, emotional things that will impact for the rest of their life, and it is a matter of months, even days, that can make the difference in this. And so if we just sit around and argue about these things, and kids are growing up without families as a result of that, that is a serious issue. Well, finally, as I kind of round the corner into the final stretch here, I do think that there should be and is a lot of great space for consensus among those of us who care passionately about children and disagree about some of the particulars here. One would be that family preservation and reunification must be a central priority. That if there's a situation where there is a birth mother that really wants and is able to raise her child, and poverty is the only issue, then I would propose that it is unacceptable to simply see intercountry adoption or any other form of adoption as the solution. Now, I would add, of course, that so often what we perceive as poverty being the only issue, it's far more complex than that. I could tell you so many stories of precious kids who it appears that poverty is the issue, but then what I've learned is, you know, that the mother remarried and the new stepfather wants nothing to do with this child and maybe even abusing the child, and so the mother is saying, well, it's poverty, but the reality is it's this new father. So it's very complex, but I would say definitively that poverty alone should never be the reason for relinquishment. And we need to engage that. And most Christian organizations out there, the bulk of hundreds of millions of dollars a year by World Vision and Compassion International is actually spent on things that essentially are focused on poverty issues. It's actually a small portion of Christian giving and involvement that's focused on caring for orphans specifically. So I think overall the balance is good, but I think those within the movement can emphasize more that importance of preserving and protecting birth families. Second, I think we can find a lot of common ground on constricting, that the constricting adoption really is no solution for children that need families. And I won't say more on that, but I just hope that we realize that if all of our efforts simply result in people saying, you know, that's too complicated, I'm gonna pull away, maybe send a few $100s overseas every now and then, and kids grow up without families, then that is unacceptable too. And then finally, I would just emphasize children need families. And I think that all of us can agree on that, whether you just look at the social science and all the things that point to the reality that children outside of parental care struggle profoundly. You know, I saw one stat just recently that if of girls that come out of orphanages in Moldova, 1 out of 10 are sex trafficked. 1 out of 10, you know, and you think if we're concerned about trafficking, let's talk about that. Kids need families for protection, for nurture, for love. And even though we're going to approach it from slightly different angles, I think we can find a real unity in that conviction. And so hopefully we'll get a chance to dialogue a little bit more in the Q&A part. But ultimately, want to come back to where I started. Despite the differences, despite some real tensions at times, we really are a family here that shares the deepest conviction that children matter. We need to engage those things together wisely and well.
Sorry, I'm shorter than Jed. First, thank you very much to Bob, to David Smullen, Jim Gash, Jay Milbrandt, Naomi Goodnow, for allowing me to be a part of this conference. It's a truly great opportunity to be here, and especially thank you to Zaina Dakaraya, who I think I called just about every other day wondering what was going on. So she's done a wonderful job with this conference, and if you see her, definitely give her a recognition and a thank you.
Let me just interrupt and say, I mean, it's hard often to find a time when somebody who's doing the organizing is actually present in the room. But many of you have corresponded with Dana Zachariah. She's been just a terrific help. Why don't we just give her a round of
And also thank you to Jed for being here, being part of this conference. I know that I think it was very courageous of him to come into this audience with some of the voices that we have and present his perspective. As I listened yesterday to the brilliant speakers and their level of knowledge and expertise, I was reminded of how uninformed I actually am about intercountry adoption in many ways. As a communication professor, law, policy, theology, exceptions, exclusions, procedures, and so on are not something I easily grasp. I tend to pay more attention to the process of conversation, our tone, and the meanings that proliferate beneath our spoken and written words. To add additional complications, this is a panel on the Christian perspectives, which for many of us has negative connotations when it comes to intercountry adoption. Christians, especially evangelicals, currently occupy a prominent place on the bullseye of what is wrong with intercountry adoption. How, therefore, is a communications professor supposed to speak on a Christian perspective? So what to do? First, I wanted to focus on communication in some form as it related to intercountry adoption. Second, I sought out inspiration from within the Christian tradition, in particular St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the great thinkers in philosophy and theology, and his work entitled Confessions. Written in 397 AD, see, I'm not very good with numbers, that's why I'm in communication. Confessions is, just as its title reveals, a confession of his life as he describes how he converted to the Christian faith. Often called the first autobiography, it tells of Augustine's life of debauchery and his conversion to Christianity. What is striking about Augustine's Confessions, according to scholar Scott MacDonald, is the paradox of inquiry that structures Augustine's pursuit of God. But more concretely, a paradox of inquiry asks, if you already know God, how can you come to know God by searching for him? Or if God has inspired you to search, how do you know if you have found him? Augustine himself asks, Lord, which comes first, to call upon you or to praise you? Must we know you before we can call upon you? What we see in Augustine, therefore, is the paradox of inquiry that led him to seek out and ultimately convert to Christianity. It is a state of paradox that ultimately led him to confess and write confessions. What does it mean to confess? Commonly, when we think of confession, most of us probably think of a prayer or entering a confessional booth where we acknowledge and disclose our sins, guilt, and wrongdoing as hopefully a means of absolving our guilt. More literally, to confess means to bring into the open that which is hidden. There are two aspects of it that I would like to focus on. First, confession is co-creative. As we confess to God, we allow for the new possibility of creation to emerge in our own lives. But this new creation cannot take root without God's or priest's communicative response. It is not enough to confess. Absolution and forgiveness must also be granted as a response. Second, to confess means to give up autonomy. In other words, when we confess, we give up our right to claim our disclosure as ours, as it is now the other's. As Caputo and Scanlon explained, confession is never mine, but the decision of the other in me who comes over me, just as in confessions it is God who turns Augustine around and Augustine who is answering. But simply we confess, we purge, we open up, and we put ourselves at the mercy of others. By now you're probably wondering, where are we going? Where is he going with this? Well, today I'm going to confess, to bring into the open that which is hidden. I'm hoping that my confession pushes us to consider the paradox we've created in our discussions about adoption. A paradox is a difficult communicative space, one full of standoffs and rigidly held positions, one that limits how we can talk with one another, what we can talk about, and how we make collaborative sense of an issue. What follows then is my confession, a stripping away of my autonomy and placing myself at the mercy of this audience. My confession reveals the paradox of adoption that I live with each and every day of my life. Confession number one, I am adopted. I was an orphan infant in Vietnam. As the story, which is admittedly full of uncertainties, goes, I was abandoned as an infant at an orphanage called An Loc in Saigon, Vietnam in 1975. At 3 weeks of age, I was airlifted as part of the famed Operation Baby Lift and evacuated to the United States. There's a film on that tonight at 7 p.m. in this room. Shameless plug. In the U.S., I was adopted at 6 weeks of age to parents who were unable to conceive. That is one version of the story. Another story has me never at the orphanage at all, but instead the son of a diplomat who made a last-minute plea on the tarmac to hand me over in the ultimate act of a parent's sacrifice. What are my original origins? I'm not 100% sure, and I probably will never know. As an adoptee, I've experienced racism, ageism, stereotyping, and the whole general experience of not knowing exactly where I fit or belong. I continue to experience grief, loss, fear of rejection, struggles with identity, and the black hole of not knowing. Confession number 2. I'm a Christian. I am Protestant, raised Baptist, converting and accepting Christ when I was 11, baptized on Easter. I even considered whether or not I had the call for ministry, going to seminary, and earning a theology degree. You can see how that worked out. I'm a communication professor. Although I did not have the call for full-time ministry, I now work at a Christian university where discussions of faith and God are regular and important. I attend a church that has evangelical views. I've led mission trips, preached and taught Sunday school. I read my Bible and pray before meals. And I do believe Christians are called to consider adoption as a way to care for widows and orphans in the world. I understand the pull at heartstrings for orphans, the call of God to adopt, and the importance of family. Yet as a Christian, I also believe it is my responsibility to engage in critical self-reflection of the church and our practices, including how it has approached intercountry adoption and the impacts of our words, beliefs, and actions regarding how we portray Christ and the faith. I'm particularly attuned to, in a communication sense, how our deeds do not always match our words. Confession number 3, I am an adoptive parent. In 2010, while living in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, my family and I adopted a 1-year-old boy from Vietnam. He is from South Vietnam, from a small and impoverished village. He was abandoned in an orphanage at 2 a.m. in the morning. He was sick and spent time in the hospital. We're not 100% sure of his birthday or the circumstances that led to his abandonment. Our son was not our first choice or match. In fact, we were matched with an older boy initially, but investigations located his birth father. We were then matched with another older boy, but investigations located an aunt and an uncle. Neither boy is granted permission for adoption, and both are still at that orphanage today. Investigations did not reveal a biological family for our son, and he was allowed to be adopted. We reviewed police reports and talked with those who were there when he was abandoned. Since adopting our son, we continue to financially support and maintain a relationship with his orphanage. I take joy and pleasure in my love for my son and how his sisters interact with him, and knowing he's an intimate and integral part of my family, my life, and who I am. Confession number 4, I'm a researcher. I work in communication studies as a researcher has looked at the experiences of internationally adopted families and how they respond to intrusive and rude questions and make sense of their family in and through communication. I've looked at issues of adoptee identity and articulated the idea of narrative burden as it relates to issues of race, racism, white privilege, and the feelings of being in between cultures and loyalties. As a researcher, my job is to expand knowledge by asking hard questions, interrogating meanings, criticizing communicative actions, and articulating the merits of knowledge and ideas on particular topics, which includes both intercountry adoption and my own faith. Confession number 5, I am an advocate. As a researcher, it's important to me that my research, knowledge, and expertise impact those who can use it most. So I've worked to engage the intercountry adoption community. This includes speaking to adoptive parents and adoptees at agencies and adoption culture camps. It includes government and agency training of professionals. It includes transcending disciplinary boundaries to engage my colleagues in psychology, counseling, social work, law, and policy at their conferences. It includes global-level conversations like this one, where adoptees, parents, practitioners, lawmakers, academics, critics, and others gather to discuss the state of intercountry adoption. I hosted one of these events while in Canada. Bob had mentioned that earlier. Most importantly, my role as advocate includes developing spaces where my adopted brothers and sisters can express their challenges, struggles, and experiences. I've been recently involved in policy work related to issues of adult adoptee citizenship and how adoptees can be more involved in having input and evaluating proposed policies. We have a panel on that this afternoon if you're interested, and I certainly invite you to join us. Confession number 6, I'm a critic of adoption. I'm a critic who cringes every time my church or a church I attend announces an adoption support group or ministry because I'm not entirely convinced that God wants it to happen in all circumstances or that it has good theological foundations. I'm a critic who thinks the reduction of intercountry adoption has helped us to focus on the appropriate role of intercountry adoption in the spectrum of child welfare and how we ought to care for and protect orphans and vulnerable children around the world. I'm a critic who understands that intercountry adoption is driven by cultural affluence, post-colonialism, and a dominance of Western and Judeo-Christian values. I'm a critic who has received a cease and desist letter from my son's adoption agency for raising hard questions about suspect practices, cultural insensitivity, and a lack of financial transparency. For the record, we did not accuse, merely asked him in a letter about whether or not some practices might be changed or adapted, only to be stonewalled and threatened. So where does that leave me? It leads me back to Augustine and paradox. It leads me back to a space where communication is paralyzed. It leads me to a place I inhabit. I'm adopted and an adoptive parent. I'm a Christian and a critic. I felt led to adopt, yet I recognize my complicity in a corrupt system. I daily experience the joy of adoption and question the motives of others. I believe God wants to care for orphans, and I believe he has entrusted us to pursue ethical and corruption-free adoptions. I believe in the right to pursue adoption, and that adoption are not and should not be a guarantee. I believe that human rights for children and cultural subsidiarity should be equally valued. I believe adoptive rights are part of the cause of adoption's problems, and I am an adoptive parent. I believe adoptive parents. That's why you should always double space. I believe in the best interests of a child, and I believe in a better system that reduces corruption. I believe the church is well-intended, and I believe the church to be misguided. You see, I'm a communication researcher, so I pay attention to what people say and how people say it. I pay attention to the kinds of discursive spaces we create and the range of resources we have available to make sense of what we experience and encounter. I pay attention to how people respond or not respond. I pay attention to the kind of meaning we make in such terms as adoption, Christian, evangelical, and family. I notice how we conflate terms like adoption, Christian, evangelical, and family, so they're equal and the same. I notice how adoption has become the only moral option, and questioning that is sinful. I see the subtle slide from orphan to fatherless to helpless to unwanted. I notice how critics obfuscate how adoption can be positive, ethical, appropriate, and redeeming in many ways and in many circumstances. And what our meanings have created, what our conversation has led to, is a paradox that instead of trying to find the good has been abandoned in favor of beating the other down. For someone like me, and I suspect others in this room, we live in a paradox with uncertainty about where we fit. We navigate these murky waters, resenting the closed discursive space, but unsure how to find our way out of it. St. Augustine saw paradox in his own narrative, and he joined a narrative in progress, one full of paradoxes. In Jesus' own words, the poor will gain the kingdom, the mourners will be comforted, and the meek will inherit the earth. The Bible even says the humble will be exalted. We must lose our life to find it. Slavery leads to freedom. The foolish are wise, the weak are strong. We die to live. We give to receive. The first are last, and the last are first. Christianity is a paradox, and our country is a paradox. It is a paradox in the way that we have framed it. This paradox has led to a polarizing space where there is no middle ground. Are you for adoption or not? Orphan rescue or human trafficking? Adoption or orphanage? Family or institution? Human rights or cultural subsidiarity? Adoptive parent or adoptee? Christian or researcher? Adoption advocate or critic? Grateful or bitter? Academic treatment or day-to-day realities of living with this? These questions frame the spaces we inhabit. In this discursive space, I'm an adoptee, an adoptive parent, a Christian, a researcher, an advocate, and a critic. And I can be all of these, quite frankly, because Augustine was. Because being a living paradox is the way the Christian life is reflected. Paradox is what led Augustine to seek God, to seek something more transcendent. Can we do that with intercountry adoption? My prayer, my confession is that we do. My confession today that we follow St. Augustine, embrace a paradox of inquiry, and resist the urge to polarize, divide, alienate, and label. Quite frankly, neither side has it completely right, and all are seeking what is in the best interest of the child. All right, so what are ways we might embrace this paradox of inquiry? Here are 9, so those of you keeping notes, 9 very tentative thoughts, some of which may be familiar to you and some of which may be new. First, we need to be co-creative and leave behind our own ideologies. If we follow Augustine in confession, we engage in a search for something more than our own positions, healing, and ideologies. We strive to be more, but we are more only when we're in conversation with those we disagree with. It is only in having paradoxical dialogues that we can transcend our own positions. It is only in listening to others and striving to see their humanity and their motivations that help us get through this paradox. We must get past the divide and move toward honest solutions that speak truth to power, truth to sending and receiving countries, and to our lawmakers and agencies, and to our families, and to our faith. Second, see the call of adoption as a way to explore the plight of orphans and how to respond not as a divine right to a child. There's an unstated maxim in this culture and in Christian circles that family is an entitlement, that when parents want a family, they have a guarantee of one, that biological failure can be circumvented by advanced technology or incorporated another person's child into their family. But vertical adoption is not a command for horizontal adoption. I'm not condemning intercountry adoption. I'm criticizing the leap we make from we are adopted as sons to we must adopt them as our sons. There's no doubt Christians are called to care for the plight of orphans in our neighborhoods, communities, and countries. But that care for orphans does not always mean we enlarge our families by reducing others. Further, orphan care as an full expression of our faith is not justification for conversion. These are not sons and daughters needing to be saved, which objectifies orphans, but they are children who need to know they are loved no matter what their faith, religious, or cultural background. Third, respect that all sides have in mind the best interest of a child. Children deserve a family, no doubt. Research demonstrates children are happier and healthier in loving, nurturing, caring families. Yet children also deserve a culture, people around them who look like them, access to their original language, and lifelong connections to their first families, including parents and extended kin. These are in the best interest of children as well. Adoption does not force the severing from a family, but consider ways that money and resources can be used to maintain cultural connections with a child for whom the best interest may be adoption. Fourth, families need to recognize that their decision to adopt is not between them and God. It is between them and the birth families, the agencies, our government, their government, and the birth culture of their child. Adoption is not just raising a child with a family, it is raising a child transnationally, transgovernmentally, transracially, and transculturally. We need a process and reforms that recognize that an adoptee's experience is not placement over a lifetime. That lifelong process is not a simple one split into two stages of placement and post-placement. It is a complex series of relationships, interactions, repetitions, traumas, joys, hurts, expressions, and more. Families and adoptees need support in this, or Russia is not going to be the only country that bans adoption from the United States. Fifth, agencies need to put the best interest of children first, not the best interests of agencies or adoption first. Agencies have grown into organizations that need adoption to survive. It is a good marketing model, but agencies have made their survival the priority over children. It is not in the best interest of children that all agencies remain in business. It is in the best interest of children that good, ethical agencies remain in business, are accredited, educate parents, support families, and offer a range of services beyond adoption in ways that care for orphans around the world. It should be an orphan care organization, not an adoption service provider. 6, researchers need to expand beyond adoptee adjustment, identity issues, counseling, impacts of institutionalization, and legal policy. These are excellent fields of research, and they should continue, but we also need theological research on birth families and their experiences born before and after relinquishment, economic models for sustainable agencies and the viability of in-country orphan care, research on what adoptees need beyond the age of 12, research comparing different cultural and governmental processes, a look at the impacts of adoption's decline on cultures and children, numbers on adult adoptees who still need citizenship, the capability of foster or kinship care in sending countries, the level of corruption in Christian-based adoptions, how much cultural connection is really necessary, and much, much more to help us move beyond the paradox we inhabit. If anything, our debate exists in a dearth of information, not an overabundance of it. More research on a broader range of topics can give us a clearer picture of what is really going on. 7th, families, both birth and adoptive, need lifetime support. Adoption is not placement, it is commitment. It is a commitment of a family. It is also the commitment of churches, agencies, and governments. When I say families, I don't just mean adoptive families, I also mean birth families. In many instances, birth moms, birth fathers, birth siblings, and others also need support and education from these same sources as they experience relinquishing a child for adoption. Counseling, financial support, employment skills, contact with their child, support groups, education, and more could be offered to the birth family. And adoptive families need for it to be okay to maintain birth family connections, to have support for when they or their child adjust and adapt to a new culture, and to be educated about issues of race, identity, and privilege from the church, agencies, and other sources in ways that are empowering and not paralyzing or isolating. 8, adoptees must have an equal and prominent place in developing policy, leading discussions, and guiding agencies. Adult adoptees are no longer children, and we can now speak for ourselves. Our lives can be examples of how past lessons can improve the future. There's a power struggle over who gets to participate in these conversations. Adoptive parents and agencies are pitted against adoptees, and this should not be. Adoptive parents and agencies need to relinquish some power and give way to the adoptee voice. The caution to adoptees: going with blame, entitlement, privilege, and arrogance will only perpetuate power imbalance. Going in with openness and a willingness to ethically dialogue and converse is not giving up power or influence. Our concerns about corruption, citizenship, race, identity abuse, and the like are better heard when we offer mutual respect and not personal attacks or the politics of destruction. Ninth, and finally, yay, being a Christian, even an evangelical one, means being a leader on an issue, modeling Christ-like humility, care, and concern. To be a leader means helping families think through whether or not adoption is an appropriate, ethical, Christ-honoring, full expression of the faith, of heeding God's call to care for orphans here and abroad, and when appropriate for the child, not when desired by the parents to place a child for adoption. It means fighting for reform and never giving hope for perfection. It means leading and hosting the dialogue and conversation. One should not think of Christian and immediately think of adoption. One should think of Christian and think of thoughtfulness, humility, care, openness, faith, and love. One should not feel as though an opposing viewpoint is immediately discounted in Christian circles. Christians should embrace the paradox, examining the plank in our own eye while letting our conversations always be full of grace. When invited to this panel, I was asked to share what it was like to be a Christian and an adoptee and an adoptive parent. There is my answer: a paradox of confession. I'm a living paradox. Each day I struggle to live within the discursive boundaries of this paradox, sometimes excited to find inspiration and sometimes saddened that I have no clear place. My faith sustains me, and I look upon my Christian brothers and sisters with a righteous suspicion. I take pleasure in being an adoptive parent, but recognize my son's losses and my own complicity in an often corrupt system. I experience the grief and loss associated with being adopted, and I am thankful and grateful that I was adopted. I employ a critical eye because it is necessary, and I still have hope we can transcend our rigid positions to create something more perfect than what we already have. What is it like to be a Christian, an adoptee, an adoptive parent, a researcher, an advocate, and a scholar? It is to live with multiple incommensurable viewpoints, always vying to destroy the others. I live in this tension every day, never feeling completely at home in any camp. We have crafted a paradox in intercountry adoption. We've crafted a paradox with such inflexibility, we believe our ideologies are the only truth available. As a Christian, I do not see my faith as one that asks for us to remain the same, one that conflates biblical stories with our own self-interest, one where family is defined only by our Western cultural standards and the ideals of a nuclear family. I see a faith that should seek to disrupt, to ask the hard questions about the nature of humanity, to vulnerably consider how we are to love our neighbor, and to own up constantly to our own moral and ethical failings. It's a faith where the fullest expression of our beliefs is not orphan care, but so much more related to social justice, worship, family, community, society, and the like. It is the faith of God's love pursuing humanity up to the sacrifice of His Son, but we narrow His love when we see our only response as orphan care. I see a faith where confession is more than a prayer or a sacrament, but a posture toward God, others, and self. So in closing, I would ask, can we use this paradox to confess, to open up, to co-create something together that requires all of us to give and to gain, to put ourselves at the mercy of one another? Can we find something more than what we have, to challenge the status quo of our own thinking and beliefs in pursuit of a radical new way of doing intercountry adoption? Can we embrace the paradox of inquiry and create new meanings in intercountry adoption, meanings that redefine the questions, the goals, the stakeholders, and the issues? Can we, especially those in the church, stop pursuing the kinds of actions that make it seem like adoption is the only morally acceptable option? Can we follow St. Augustine and embrace the paradox and write our own confessions?